Okay. I am extremely excited to be here. I get to interview not only a great author, but a great friend of mine, David Lee Summers. Not only is he a fantastic writer, he also is the publisher of two of my books. Um, David, the first question I wanted to ask you, I read your book, Heirs of the New Earth. Amazing story. I love that the way you use technology. The Clipper ship in space absolutely blew my mind. But what really hit me was most science fiction writers either have the post-apocalyptic nuclear future, or they have the Star Trek, The Next Generation utopian future. What really, really grabbed me into your stories was the way you pictured the future. You kind of found that ideal middle ground where we had advanced technology, we had space travel, but we all had to wear masks and take injections because everything was so polluted. It just, you found this middle ground, which was incredible. Personally, what is your take of our future in the next 200 years? Where do you see us as a species? Do you see utopia, or do you see us like you made up in your books?
Well, that was the thing I was really shooting for in these books was, this is my, what now is called my Space Pirates Legacy series. And Heirs of the New Earth is actually the final novel in that 4-book series. So you leapt right into it
Yeah.
at the very end of the whole thing. But what I was
What was great, though, if I can just say, is that I'm sorry I had it, but the book was so well done. I didn't have to go back and read it. It just reached out and it grabbed you. And the way there was enough spice and sprinkle for the backstory that I got the whole thing. It was amazing.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, as far as the question, yeah, one of the things I really wanted to do in that series was I always felt like, Star Trek always felt just a little too perfect to me. And a lot of the other, the dystopias always felt just a little too dark to me. And, humanity, our history has been this sort of wonderful mix of just moving forward, but, kind of getting in our own, kind of tripping over our own feet, getting in our own way at times. And, I wanted to kind of convey that, we're going to move forward, but, there's going to be things we're going to get wrong. And,
Yeah,
there are going to be
definitely.
ways that we want to be able to, I want to have this this look at this kind of realistic future, and that was what I really tried to portray. Because I think, like I say, I think we will get better. We will get further out into space. We're going to try harder as we meet aliens. I think it'll help to bring out a lot of our better selves. But we're still human beings. We've still got greed. We've still got industries that are going to want to take advantage of those things that natural resources, and that conflict is always sort of going to be there. And hopefully in the long run, we'll be better more of the time than we'll be bad. But I think it'll be, I think that's the, that's where it really comes down to, is I think we'll be a little mix of both of those things.
Wow, excellent. And the other thing, you go from writing, being published by a publisher, and then you make the huge quantum leap to Hadrosaur Productions. What compelled you to make that move? That's a huge jump from writer to author to now I'm owning my own publishing production company. What made you make that big jump?
So for me, the two really actually go back to the beginnings of when I really started writing novels. And this all has to, it was kind of something that it has to do with the way the company was working for a long time. The company itself actually started when my wife was in graduate school at the University of Arizona. And this was back in the 90s. And she was in an entrepreneurship program. And we talked about what kind of company could she start. And we talked about, what are you really passionate about? And she was passionate about was publishing. And we thought, you know, what would be a really innovative idea at the time in the early 90s was audio publishing. So what we actually did for our very first project was the very first book in this whole Space Pirates Legacy series was The Pirates of Sufira, which I wrote back around that time. And we got a whole bunch of my coworkers together from Kitt Peak National Observatory, and we actually recorded the book, you know, on cassette tapes.
Oh, wow.
And you know, started distributing this thing at science fiction conventions. And, you know, quite frankly, we didn't have the money, the expertise to really do this right. You know, I think there were, you know, we made some fans because I think a lot of people just kind of love this little, you know, fan-made, homemade kind of approach to things. But soon after that, I ended up getting with a publisher who took on Pirates, and then from there, it had been in book format since then. So what became of the company was we thought, well, we would continue this sort of audio wing of the company. And we decided that what we would do was we would create a showcase for authors that we might publish in audio. And this became an anthology called Hadrosaur Tales, you know, for Hadrosaur Productions. And what happened was the anthology, which ultimately became essentially a magazine, ended up taking on a whole life of its own. And so we did Hadrosaur Tales as a science fiction and fantasy magazine for 10 years. And then around that time was when I actually met Jacqueline Druga of LBF Books.
Right.
And you know, I was talking to her, I was talking to Nick Johns, who was the art director at the time, and we said, you know, I have this little magazine, you know, it's just a little digest kind of thing, you know, let's actually put some effort into this and do it right. And so the whole thing got reformatted as Tales of the Talisman magazine. And we did that for 10 years. And, you know, after 20 years of doing magazines, I said, okay, you know, the magazines are great, but you know, I want to take this company to another level. It's kind of like the magazines are taking all of my time that I'm not writing, and I want to showcase people better. And that's when we really made the transition into publishing other authors, such as you, such as you know, such as such as David Riley, such as Laura Givens. You know, it's like really, you know, Don Braden, and you know, just wanting to give people a chance, and you know, to continue doing anthologies, which again, our anthologies have done really well. You know, like the Kepler anthologies I've done with Steve Howell from NASA, and you know, these are just perennial sellers, and I think I'm glad to be doing that.
Awesome. It's funny because I didn't realize that Tales of the Talisman was your magazine until much later on, because that was when it was with LBF, because that was the first thing I ever got published. Was my first short story was in that magazine.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And I still have the 2 copies up in my room.
Excellent. Which issue were you in? Now I need to make.
I have to go back and dig them up. But it was back like in 2005 or 2006.
Excellent.
I remember because you had to upload it to this thing on their website, and then you could go back and check every couple of days. I'm like, it's never gonna work. I'm never gonna get accepted. I'm like, oh my God.
No,
yeah, but that's great. I love that. There was some great stuff in that magazine. I love that.
No, it was great, and I got to work with, you know, so many people, and a lot of them have gone on to some great success. I mean, there's people like Beth Cato and Neil Asher, and you know, it's just like, you know, the fact that these guys are like people that you walk into Barnes and Noble and see on the shelf, you know, is a real honor to me that they have moved on to that kind of level.
That is amazing. You have got like a huge, robust, powerful history in this, and it kind of makes sense to take that next step. Right. Now, where do you see this going? Say, what's your I guess, timeline plan? Where do you see yourself in 5 years with this? Do you want to get bigger? Are you trying to get into, well, almost like bookstores aren't really dying, but are you trying to establish a brand that can go into bookstores? Do you want to have a bigger online presence? What's your goal for this productions? Where do you see it?
So, again, people sometimes ask about, we're a publishing company that calls ourselves Productions. And of course, that partly goes to the audio, but it partly is a look ahead at the future. I would really love to see us get into kind of a multimedia kind of presence. And I have done some collaborative work with Sealy Studios in Tucson. We're currently working on an audio edition of Firebrandt's Legacy from my Space Pirates Legacy books. We did a short film, essentially an extended book trailer of my novel, The Astronomer's Crypt, which you can see at davidleesummers.com. And, what I really would like to do is get to a point where we can bring these opportunities to the authors working with Hadrosaur, and maybe even authors beyond Hadrosaur, but where we all kind of work together to share this expertise and bring this to people. So, again, it's like I say, Sealy is in on this, and they're brainstorming ideas. We can do this. I'm kind of working on them, with this. So, I'd really like to see us go in that direction. Of course, I would love to see us, higher profiles in bookstores as well. But I think, if we can kind of leverage all these different directions of audio, of video, of writing, the actual books themselves, and maybe some other merchandise, I think this would be a great direction to go in the long run.
I have to throw this unscheduled question there because it kind of caveats on what you just said. Bookstores. Do you see bookstores being around in the next 5 or 10 years, or do you think they're going to go the way of Blockbuster?
That's a good question, and it's I absolutely love and treasure the indie bookstores around that are hanging in there and doing, making kind of curating books and making those available to specialty audiences in different neighborhoods, and knowing their clientele. Now Barnes and Noble, I love them and I love visiting them, but they're such they've been struggling a lot at the corporate level from things that you see in the newscast, and it's like, it's really hard to say, are they going to go the way of Borders? And I worry that they could. I think it's going to, I'm not quite going to bet on it. I think it's maybe more of a 50-50 kind of gamble, one way or the other. I think it really depends on how they play it at a corporate level, and what they do with their stores, and how well they engage with their local audiences, their local clientele, and get to know that. But yeah, it's, I think one possible future certainly is that in the long run, we end up buying all of our books online, and whether they be ebooks or get our print books online. And then it ends up being that if you want print books, you go see authors at a convention or something like that.
Yeah, because I'm always wondering, because a lot of people like the old school dinosaurs like myself, buying a book is a physical, tactile experience. I like to pick the book up, run, boom, open a page, read. It's a physical experience. And I think more and more, like my son who's in his 30s and my daughter in their 20s, they'd rather go to their Kindle, download 10 books, buy an entire series for like $1.99 a book, have them 10 or 15 books in their Kindle and just read it. Oh, yeah. I struggle with that. I want to have the book in my hand. I'm that old school, stubborn. I have a Kindle. I look at it and I have to have the book. I like the flip of the pages. I mean, that's just my personal preference. But there are more and more people that aren't like me that would rather download it. It's much easier.
Oh yeah, and it's like there are things I love about my Kindle. I love the fact that it's backlit, so when my wife and I are going to sleep, and I want to read a little bit late at night, I can
Yeah.
use the backlight on it. It's like, okay, that's kind of a nice feature. But I'm like you, I like the tactile side of it. I love being able to go to events and interact with authors, and I do know a few people who buy inexpensive Kindles and have authors sign them. But it's not quite the same as going and taking a book that you love by an author and having them sign that book
I
for
can't
you.
see. Can you sign my Kindle?
I have signed a couple of them.
Wow. All right. The next thing I've got for you, getting back to David Lee Summers, the writer. Um, what spurs your creativity when you're crafting and writing a story? What really gets your creative juices going?
So for me, pretty much just for me, it's kind of life in general. I take my cues from watching everything kind of around me. I work at an observatory. Actually working with people who are studying exoplanets, studying stars. We were talking before the interview about swapping ghost stories and things like
Yeah.
that. You work late at night in an observatory where there's maybe two or three of you, and you hear spooky sounds. It's hard not to kind of share spooky stories in that situation. So
Right.
all of these kinds of things just serve as my inspiration. I live in southern New Mexico. I am it's just such a historic kind of area. I like to say, Pat Garrett, the guy who shot Billy the Kid, is buried a quarter of a mile behind my backyard. And when I do my walks through the
Oh,
neighborhood, I walk right by Pat Garrett's burial site. And how do you not be influenced when you're seeing Albert J. Fountain, who was in the midst of the whole Lincoln County War, right? His memorial is there, and you see these famous people from history. And it's like when I drive back, when I drive between my home and the observatory, I drive through Geronimo's stronghold. All of these things just influence and all become part of the stew that kind of becomes inspirations for stories. And my dad used to take, we used to do family trips where we would drive around, different places. And I kind of, one of the times that really stands out to me is we're driving through northern New Mexico, where one of the few really big battles in the western United States in the Civil War happened at a place called Glorieta Pass, just north of Santa Fe. And he played the what if game with me. What if the Confederacy had won that engagement instead of the Union, which is what happened. And he started throwing out these scenarios about the Confederacy going up to Denver and capturing the Mint and all of that. And that's like perfect training for a science fiction writer, because you start asking, what if something happened different than the way you thought it might happen. So
that's incredible. And when you actually, okay, you have the idea in your head for a story, the natural progression to that is when you sit down. I mean, I stole the term from my son. Are you the architect, where you construct the outline and the A, B, C, D, E? Are you the gardener? You just sit down and it has to come out, and whatever grows, grows.
well, I'm definitely I'm definitely an outliner, an architect. I sit there and plan out my stories these days. But while I'm planning and while I'm doing that kind of architect phase, I feel very much like a gardener. And it's I feel like I kind of go where the story takes me. It's my outlines aren't a real strict here's Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, A, B, C. It's more like here's plot point A, here's plot point B, here's plot point C. And sometimes it's like an ideal will grab me enough that I'll actually write a partial scene right there as I'm doing the outline. And that becomes kind of
Wow.
my process for doing the beginning of the book. And sometimes even as I'm writing one of these scenes, it was in one of my steampunk books. I like to tell the story that I was writing the story of a face-off between a samurai warrior and Wyatt Earp. Okay, and in the middle of it, it's like there's an explosion. That wasn't in my outline. I was like, what? Okay, let's run with it and see where this goes. Who's blasting into the compound in the middle of this
Wow.
thing. And that ended up going off on its own whole different direction. And I had to rewrite that whole, I loved where I went with it. And I said, okay, I just need to rewrite that part of the outline to get back to where we get back into the main part of the story.
Oh, that's incredible. And again, this is a great caveat to the next question. What was that? There's a moment for me in my life that I decided, you know what? I want to write books. I want to tell a story. For you, what was that one incident or that one moment that you said, you know what? I, David Lee Summers, want to write books?
That
Or was there a bunch of different things?
it was a bunch of different things. But what I really remember is when I was really young. I must have been like 8 or 9 years old or so. And as a kid, I was a big fan of Star Trek. And I would watch it like every single afternoon. And it's like, when you're that young, you're kind of just getting conscious that these are actors putting on a play, that someone's written. And the beauty of Star Trek is you had, each episode begins right with big letters in the credits, written by. And I started discovering these people with written by had books in my library. People like, Harlan Ellison, Theodore Sturgeon, and David Gerrold. It's like I could go to my library and check out other stories by these guys. And right around that time was when David Gerrold actually came out with his book, The Trouble with Tribbles, which was his story of how he wrote the episode for the series, where he came up with the idea, how he developed it, and actually gave you some snippets of drafts on the way to actually creating, what ultimately would become one of the most iconic episodes of the series. And I thought, wow, being a writer is something you can do professionally. And that was maybe the moment when I really got set on the path of, this is something I would really like to work towards doing. And the very first time I really sat there and said, maybe I've got an idea for a book. This comes a little later, when I was in high school, and I was with one of my high school buddies, and we said, we saw, this was the time when the Star Trek novels were really coming out, like one a month from Pocket Books, and in some ways I think Simon and Schuster still is almost that kind of rate. And we were just devouring these things at that time, and we said, I bet we could write one of these, and we just laid in, and we came up with our story, and that's my first unpublished novel was a Star Trek novel that I wrote back then. But it kind of, and I look back at it and I see all the, every single amateur mistake you could make in that very first book. But it was the thing that got me over the hump that, gee, I could actually write. And, and then, to take that one step further, my friend and I went to an assembly at his high school. We actually went to two different high schools in the same town and knew each other through church. And but Ray Bradbury came to speak, and so we were, he went and picked me up, and we were walking on campus, and we're caught by the principal, my first thought was busted. I'm from another school. I don't have an official permission slip. And I had my tape recorder with me, and maybe my teacher called ahead. That's the one thing I kind of think might have happened in the background that I didn't necessarily know about at the time. But she says, "Are you reporters from other high schools?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, Mr. Bradbury's eating lunch in the library right now. Would you like to join him?" Here I am,
Oh,
16 years old, and I get to go basically sit down and have lunch with Ray Bradbury and, two or three other teachers. And, we basically, I sat there in awestruck silence
oh yeah.
for most of that. And, I did get up the courage to ask him a question in the assembly, but afterwards he said, I'm getting together with a few of the teachers. We went up to him to ask, just to say thanks for, letting us spend time with you. It was great to meet you, and get a couple of the books signed. And he said, we're getting together with a couple of the teachers after this. Would you like to come out with us? And he told us where they were meeting. And so we came out, and that was actually when I got a chance to talk to him. And during that, I was telling him, I was working on short stories. The two of us were working on a book together. And he looked at me and said, "Are you submitting your stories?" And I said, "Well, not yet. I'm not sure if I'm quite to that level." And he looked at me and he pointed at me and he said, "Send your stuff to a magazine now." It's like, okay, you have
Well,
faith in me. And, so years later, and this is the epilogue of that part of the story, was, when I did actually get my first official SFWA pro rate sale to Realms of Fantasy magazine, I sent a copy of it off to Ray Bradbury with a thank you for prodding me. And he sent me back just this lovely letter saying, I'm proud of you, how, what great work you've done. And it's a fine story. And, how do you?
wow. That's amazing.
Yes. So
That would motivate me too.
So whenever I start feeling down about the whole business, that letter sits in my file cabinet because I don't want it to get sunstruck or anything. But it's the thing I take out and remind myself that there are times in all of this that's worth it. So
Definitely. So in your writing career, I mean, everybody has their God, their ups and their downs, and boy, I could write a series of books on the downs. But what has been your biggest personal accomplishment you feel, and then what has been what you felt your biggest setback, and then how did you overcome that setback and move forward?
well, as far as the biggest accomplishment, I'm actually going to play show and tell a little bit. Certainly
Awesome.
that first story in that first story in Realms of Fantasy magazine, that was a big personal accomplishment. But another one of my big sales was in this book, Straight Outta Tombstone, and edited by David Boop, published by Baen Books, and features some of my characters from my steampunk series. But I'm in this, alongside me in this book are people like Jim Butcher, Alan Dean Foster, Robert E. Vardaman, Jody Lynn Nye, Larry Correia, people who really have been heroes of mine all through my writing career. There are other friends of mine in this book, people like Nicole Givens Kurtz, who I've admired as a writer, but we've known each other from conventions for a long time. Sam Knight, it was just such a thrill to be in this book with them, and to have characters from my novels actually show up in a book alongside these characters. It's like, to me that was just on top of the world. And then I even got to do a signing with several of them up at a bookstore in Denver. So it's like to actually sit right with these guys doing the signing was just a whole lot of fun. So that's the big accomplishment. It's I think all of us have our downs, like you say. And I was trying to think, what's the biggest setback? And I probably the biggest one was I mentioned that I had sold my novel, The Pirates of Sufiro. That first publisher that took it, they ended up going bankrupt and sort of disappearing off the map. And so I actually had to go through the whole process of, and they were like Lycosis, they were a Canadian company. So I actually had to go hire a Canadian solicitor to go essentially sue them to get my rights back, to get the publishing, to get the publishing rights back, to try to get any royalties that I might have gotten off of the book. I never saw a dime off the first mass market edition of the thing. And, man, that was just a blow. I thought, is anyone going to take this series seriously at all again? And, how do you pick yourself up from that? And I think there's a couple of things that really helped in that. And one is realizing you're not alone. I mean, and pretty much you talk to any author and you realize everyone's got a horror story, from, they pretty much have all run into something somewhere that's bad that's happened to them. So we realize, okay, we've got that. The other side of that is, in this particular case, it's like we actually did this as a class action. So, I got to know a couple of the other authors who were also going through this with that particular publisher at the time, and, just exchanging emails and kind of being there for each other. And I think the other part of this is you've just got to keep writing. And in my case, I kind of abandoned my Space Pirates legacy characters for a while. And, I ended up going from that to working on my what would become my Scarlet Order vampire series. I started writing the vampire characters, and it's like, people ask, why vampires? Well, I was in kind of a dark place at that time in my life, so I start that is part of that story. But where this ended up leading me is, that also brings me up to the point where I met Jake Druga of LBF Books. And actually the vampire book was what I sent to her as the book that, would you be interested in publishing this? And, she wrote back and said, oh my God, I absolutely love it. I want to publish it. And what else do you have? And so I trotted out Pirates of Sufiro and Children of the Old Stars, because by this point I had the formal court order that said that the rights had reverted back to me. That there was nothing, that was all taken care of and a done deal. And she looked at it and she took it on and said, I'll take it if you have a third book. And that third book became Heirs of the New Earth. So we edited the first two. They brought them out with the LBF editions, and then we did Heirs of the New Earth. I wrote that for Jake, and the rest, as they say, is history. After that, then LBF was bought by Lycosis, and that's how those books ended up with them.
Wow. Yeah, I remember the email from Jackie for Force Vengeance, the hybrid Force Vengeance, and I still, that's the thing that I have printed out in an envelope in my drawer upstairs. That first acceptance. Because I went through the Publish America fiasco. I don't know if you're familiar with that publishing company.
Yeah, I knew some people who went through that.
They had hybrid. They had hybrid hostage for about 3 years.
Oh God, yeah.
There was some drama with that. But I got to ask, everybody has that one book that you can just pick up and reread over and over and over again, even though you know every line by heart. What's your book?
So for me, this was probably no surprise given what I said earlier, but I have to go with Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles. Just because he is the beauty of the prose, the way he brings his personal experience to this idea of exploring Mars, I mean, you know, some people talk about Chronicles being a dated book because it's, you know, we know that there's not life on Mars now from the science side, but the poetry of that book is just so gorgeous, you know. And I mean, I could almost say this with any Bradbury book, but that one in particular is very near and dear to my heart. So.
Wow, that is a great choice. And movie, same thing with a movie.
Now this one, you know, I'm actually going to go away from science fiction for this one a little bit, and I'm gonna say the Milagro Beanfield War. And this was a Robert Redford film done back in the 80s. It's kind of a magical realism film about northern New Mexico, and it's basically about the small town against a big corporate development thing. But what I absolutely love in that film is, you know, people talk about, you know, seeing the first time that they come across a book where they see themselves reflected in. And that movie, it's like I saw the people from my mom's hometown in northern New Mexico for the first time in a major motion picture. And I saw the kind of almost, you know, that almost, you know, that just taking it for granted that angels and spirits and such all exist around us. And, you know, just that whole, you know, the multiculturalism of that part of the state, you know, which we have down here in southern New Mexico where I live as well. But, you know, the flavor is a little different between the two halves of the state, like, you know, a lot of states are. And, but that movie just did a delightful job of capturing it. And I've been fortunate enough to also meet John Nichols, who was the author of the book and the screenplay for that movie. And
Wow.
he lives up in Taos, New Mexico. And yeah, just great. And my favorite story with him is my oldest daughter is named Miranda. And before he even, you know, I actually met him, well, I'd met him before my kids were born, and then I got a chance to talk to him at there was a book festival here in Las Cruces, and my daughter was very young at the time, maybe 3-4 years old. And I had her with me, and he looks at her as a little girl, and he says, "I bet your name is Miranda, and I bet you love to dance." And both of those things are just absolutely true. It was just that lovely bit of insight that you know, sort of almost was like her, almost like predicting the future. It was just wonderful.
Wow. Okay, and then if you had one kernel, one nugget of wisdom to give to, I'd say, someone like my son who's just starting out trying to write, what is the one kind of Confucius saying you would say to somebody, here's what you should do?
I think the big thing I would say is read everything you can get your hands on. Read, you know, paying attention. Just read, you know, read in your genre of choice, read outside your genre of choice. You know, Ray Bradbury used to actually be very specific and say, read one short story a day, read one poem a day, read one essay a day. Because if you do that, your education in writing will just go up magnitudes. And for a period of time, I did exactly that. And man, you know, poetry will just teach you, you know, economy of language and finding the right words, you know. And I've actually, you know, been fortunate enough to publish a few poems, and I think there is a lot to be said about reading poetry. There's, you know, I sometimes, you know, reading outside the genre of choice. It's like, you know, I picked up a few, you know, Western novels, picked up a few romance novels, and it's like, gee, you know, it's like, okay, I'm not going to write this novel, but, you know, the way this romance novel handles, you know, this romantic encounter, you know, I can bring that to my science fiction novel and give it a whole quantum leap level of emotional engagement that I might not have done. You know, maybe this Western novel, you know, of course, science fiction and Westerns have long, you know, played on each other, but you know, it's like you see the frontier kind of come to life in a Western novel in a way that you might not think about in a science fiction novel. You know,
Right.
characters interacting, and you might think, you know, I could bring that, you know, maybe it's not the Native Americans and the settlers, but maybe it's the blue people and the green people or something like that. You know, it's
Right.
you know, you can take lessons from these things. So my kernel of knowledge is read everything you can get a hold of.
All right.
Make
And then
that time.
the last question, super controversial. Just hang on, here it comes. Marvel or DC? Which universe?
Uh, I love them both, but I'm not going to comp out entirely. I will, you know, I've been reading a lot of DC lately because I've been going back and catching up on the Jeff Johns era of Justice Society, which is just absolutely wonderful. But if I had to pick my absolute favorite, you know, and I'm going to bring, my daughter made this for me, and you can probably see the squirrel tail behind it.
Squirrel Girl.
And that's Marvel's Unbeatable Squirrel Girl.
Squirrel Girl.
And, you know, it's just what I love about the comic is it's like, you know, it's exciting and fun in all the ways of the Marvel universe. You know, it does everything Marvel did, you know, it did everything Marvel did right, but it just had this whole positive spin to it. But so many comics go so dark, and this just kept it light and fun, like the comics of my youth. And this particular little stuffy that my daughter made for me is actually in issue number 40 of Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. They actually have a picture of my daughter with this in the letters section. So
that's amazing.
So with all,
it's funny because my brother-in-law loves the Squirrel Girl too, and he sent me one comic where she was auditioning for the Fantastic Four, and it's absolutely hysterical.
And I do have to tell you, you know, just going back to Tales of the Talisman, Erica Henderson, who was drawing Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, she did art for Tales of the Talisman.
Wow.
Her dad had, you know, recommended her to me. C.J. Henderson, who wrote a number of stories in the magazine, was her dad. And
wow,
he
that's incredible.
You know, and so, you know, of course, like any proud dad, you know, with an artistically talented daughter, said, you know, maybe you should do some, you know, hire her for some artwork. And you know, we ended up doing it, you know, getting her for an illustration or two before, you know, she went off to art school, and you know, now is you know, majorly famous. So.
Oh my God, this has been an absolute joy and pleasure, man. This has been great. And I've learned so much just about, you know, you. I mean, I say you're a friend of mine, and you are. And, you know, maybe people don't realize, I mean, you gave me a huge break, and you took a really big chance on me when I thought my writing career was dead. And you know, I can say cyberly, I mean, I owe you a huge thank you, because you took a chance on me when a lot of people may not have. And I sincerely appreciate that. And this has been a great pleasure for me talking to you and getting the chance to ask you some questions.
Oh, it's been a pleasure for me too, Greg. And it's, you know, we've, like a lot of people in the writing world, you know, we actually do most of our correspondence by email. You know, so this has been really our first opportunity to really just sit down and face to face hang out and talk, and that's,
I know,
great. And it's an honor for me to be able to publish you and bring your words to Hadrosaur's audience, and I hope we can do right by you and find ways to get them out to even greater audiences as time goes on.
well, it's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And we'll thank you for this opportunity to talk.
All right. Excellent.
Okay.